Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking with Dr. Matthew McKay about the changing landscape of therapy and evidence-based resources. Dr. McKay is the co-founder of New Harbinger Publications and a professor at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. He has authored and co-authored numerous books, including the Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook, the Dialectical Behavior Therapy Skills Workbook, Self-Esteem, and Couple Skills, which have sold more than 4 million copies combined. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology and specializes in the cognitive behavioral treatment of anxiety and depression. Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. We've been looking forward to this for a while. We have a lot of questions and things that we want to talk about with the changing landscape of therapy and the origin of New Harbinger and the self-help workbook. So thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
So we thought we'd start off by talking a little bit about the founding of New Harbinger. Can you tell us your experience with that?
Well, like a lot of important events, it starts with two guys walking into a bar. And my partner, Pat Fanning, met me, and we were having some drinks, and he kind of waited until I was 3 sheets to the wind and finally sprung on me this idea that we were going to start a publishing company. And we had done a little mimeograph literary magazine in the past that we used to sell when we were hitchhiking around the country to get us from one town to the next. And I thought that's what he was talking about, but he was actually much more serious, and he had the idea that we would really create a real publishing company. He was working for a publisher at the time, so he had some good ideas about how to do it. And I was, I think at the time, just finishing my graduate school training, and I'd been working with clients then for a while in internships and practicum settings. And so I had some ideas about what people needed in terms of psychological tools and self-help strategies. And so it felt like, well, maybe that's something that we can do with this publishing company. So he just wanted to start something and become a publisher. I wanted to see what we could do with a publishing program that really addressed the needs of the clients that I was working with.
Yeah, and to go off of that, so what need did you see when you were working with clients early on for evidence-based resources, or where did the idea for the self-help workbook come from originally?
Well, it was clear that the self-help books of that era were books that basically would describe a problem. You know, 3/4 of the book would be describing the problem, and then there would be some inspirational material in the last couple of chapters, like you can change. Things that were not necessarily specific or certainly not evidence-based. So the self-help genre then really didn't, in my view, give clients the tools they needed to. Readers, the tools they needed to change their lives. And I was trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist, and those tools of stress management, dealing with anxiety, depression, so forth, that I was learning weren't really available in the self-help literature. It just wasn't there. And it felt to me like this was an area that we could move into and provide something that no one else was offering. The actual idea for a workbook really kind of belonged to Pat, because he was a guy that liked to read, popular mechanics and other kinds of books that would lay out, step by step, how do you build a windmill in your backyard, and how do you create an irrigation system for your house. And so there would be these kind of interesting articles, but they were all step by step. They were just like, first you do this and then you do this. And so each step built on the one before it in a way that allowed people to actually do something fairly complicated uh, and yet, following the steps actually succeed in building whatever it was. So he wanted to kind of use that sort of format, and so we began to think about how would we structure a book that taught specific steps or tools in a way that people could actually learn them. And then we also wanted to teach it in three different ways. One was just by precept, telling people, here's what you do, and then by experience, so that there were worksheets and experiential exercises for the reader to actually start implementing and trying this new skill. And then finally, there were examples of how someone else would do this. And so we were trying to uh, teach skills in a way that really hadn't been done before, and in a workbook format. It's kind of like, if you have uh, you're working on your car, and you buy a mechanical a book that tells you how to repair and do things. And usually these books are like 8 by 10 or 8 by 11, and so that was the idea. We're gonna have something like people will have to repair their cars, only it's going to be to repair their lives and build new skills.
I love the origins of that because it takes a concept that's so seemingly easy to do, like this, step by step process, but you really get to learn so much really deep knowledge through that format. So, can you talk a little bit about how New Harbinger is definitely known for its evidence-based materials? How did the process of the rigorous evidence-based standard come about for New Harbinger?
Well, I think we wanted techniques, strategies, interventions, if you will, that were proven, that were shown to work. We didn't want to just offer people, we'll try this, try that, and good luck. It was the idea was that we wanted to offer readers something they could count on, and if they followed the steps and did the work, that it would reliably create important changes in their lives. And so we looked for books that were based on evidence, based on actual psychological research. And by this time, cognitive behavioral therapy was starting to really coming into its own. And there was now, and this burgeoning uh, area of research, showing how different kind of treatment protocols really did reduce the suffering of individuals, reduced anxiety, reduced depression, reduced shame, reduced the effects of trauma. And we're, all this new research and data was coming out. And so we wanted to publish books that utilized that, and that people could trust.
Yeah, I appreciate the background for that because obviously, New Harbinger's mission is evidence based, and we talk a lot about that in part of selling New Harbinger's mission. But it's really interesting to hear how that was at the origin and really at the forefront of building the company and when we acquired books. And kind of going back to the origin and when you were deciding, the evidence based model, I want to talk about the Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook and the origin of that book and why it's so important to New Harbinger's story, kind of how that came to be.
Well, the Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook, uh, actually, the co-author, one of the co-authors, Martha Davis, was working at Kaiser at the time. She was also my girlfriend, and she was working at Kaiser, and Kaiser wanted her to do a stress reduction group, and she was going to put together a little mimeograph pamphlet of some stress reduction strategies hand out to the clients in her group. And I said, well, don't don't make a little wimpy pamphlet. Let's do a book. And so we did. I mean, we put this thing together. She had there was another person at Kaiser that she was working with, and and so we basically collected all of the evidence-based self-help stress reduction strategies that were then in existence. And then we decided to put them in little short chapters that were just exactly what Pat had originally envisioned. Like step one, step two, step three, here's how you do it. And then another chapter. And it was sort of a grab bag. You could pick and choose among the chapters to see what particular techniques worked for you, what you were attracted to, what you desired. And so that actually worked very well. I mean, we're totally naive. We published this book in what it was 1979, and we had no idea that it would really take off in the way it did. And it ended up selling well over 1 million copies, and there was this big demand for help with stress. But we just naively put it together because Martha was doing these stress reduction, and we actually did a lot of the actual printing and page layout and typesetting, all that we did basically ourselves. So it was really a fun project, and one that we hoped would be helpful to people. The next book we did, which was Thoughts and Feelings, I think I was still in graduate school, or was just getting out of graduate school at the time we did that book. And the last class I took in graduate school was a class in cognitive behavioral therapy, and all of the students in that class at the end of the class put together, each of them was assigned a certain cognitive behavioral therapy technique, and they were assigned to do a paper on it, and all the papers had the same format. So basically I had this whole collection of papers on how to do basic cognitive behavioral therapy, and I rewrote them all, and that became Thoughts and Feelings. But again, it was evidence-based. The focus was what were these techniques and strategies were things that had been tested. There was a research and science basis for them, and so we felt like people could count on this, that they could trust that these things could help.
Yeah. So after the two first books kind of came to you organically, what was the early day process for figuring out what topics to publish into?
Well, in the beginning, it was a lot of it was sort of me thinking, well, what do we need here? Or what do my clients need? What are they struggling with? And where are the holes in the literature? There were books, for example, on anxiety, but none of the books were workbooks. None of them were the step-by-step approach that we wanted to take. And so we kept looking for something like that. And finally, Ed Bourne came along with the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook, and it was evidence-based. It was exactly what we were looking for. Um, it taught these new important skills for dealing with anxiety in a step-by-step way, and we happily, and we passed up a number of books that were later published by other publishers that didn't really fit the bill. And when we saw Ed's book, this was what we had been waiting for, and we published it, and it turned out to be a great bestseller. So in the beginning, we'd be looking for books of a certain kind, and often it was very hard to find them because people were not writing self-help like that. They were still writing the old-fashioned self-help of describing a problem for 6 or 8 chapters, and then finally a few inspirational ideas at the end. So this was new, and in some ways we had to train authors how we wanted these books to be formatted and presented. And of course, things would come in over the transom too. Sometimes we'd be, we'd get something in that excited us, and so but that was sort of the exception rather than the rule. It was more like we were having to go out and find people and to help them develop these books.
Sure. And the vantage point you have, Matt, from kind of being around it, not at the inception of the self help category, but really in the beginning and watching it kind of change over time from those really problem and then sort of inspirational endings to a more problem and solution. And the self help category has just transformed so much over the years into different formats. So my question was, what have you seen over the years in that category and the changes that have taken place? Like even early on when you're talking about it changing to like more solutions based on what New Harbinger was doing, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the category?
Well, I think the biggest change is moving from advice, by some psychotherapist who's been in practice for a while, and they've put together or collated some of their experiences, and they've decided, that they're going to offer some advice to folks. And moving from that to the kinds of books that we're doing, which are very oriented toward how to change your life, and the specific skills and steps necessary to do that. So I think that's how, and I would say, most self-help books now are being written in similar to what our original approach is. How do you make changes in your life, and what steps do you have to take to do that? So I think that has been a huge improvement, because now there's still books that are not research based, and there's still books that are based on somebody's bright idea that hasn't really been founded on science or evidence. But there are fewer of those books. And the other thing that's happened that's really changed is that psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy were the vogue in the 40s and 50s. And then toward the end of the 60s and early 70s, that began to shift, and behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy really became more impactful, and had, there were more and more people in the field who were doing that work. And that's continued to tip over time, so that now, the majority of therapists are really doing cognitive behavioral second or third wave work, and evidence-based therapy. So that's really changed dramatically in the time I've been a therapist. I've been a psychotherapist for 45 years or something, and I've seen that change happen steadily. And so, because therapists are doing evidence-based work and are more and more offering cognitive behavioral interventions to their clients, self-help books are more and more based on and built on those kinds of interventions.
Not only as a clinician yourself, but as a professor teaching up and coming clinicians, what has your experience been seeing the second and third waves of therapy come about?
Yeah, uh, I, when I was starting out, behavioral therapy was basically, uh, Volpe and Skinner, and it was all about changing behavior. They didn't really relate to thoughts at all, and it was about, how do we reinforce new, more adaptive, more effective behavior? How do we stop doing things that are problematic and do more of the things that enhance life? And so that was, and there's a lot of focus on contingency management again, and reinforcement. And then the shift started happening in the late 70s, when Beck was writing, and starting to talk about the importance of thoughts, and also Albert Ellis, rational motive behavior therapy. They were talking about, it's more than just what observable behavior. It's what you're thinking, because what you're thinking has a tremendous influence on your emotions and on your behavior. So we're going to have to address that. Whereas the original behavior is like, what's in your mind is a black box. We can't go there. That's off limits. But Beck and Ellis and others that followed were saying, no, we can impact your thoughts. We can influence what you think, and in influencing what and how you think, we can actually change how you feel. And so that the whole ABC model of the second wave of behavior therapy was, okay, you have an event of some kind that triggers a thought and a mental reaction to that event, and then your emotions follow from that mental reaction, and your behavior follows from your mental reaction and your emotions. So it was so-called ABC theory, with the B being your thoughts, your cognitions, as having a central role in ultimately how you feel and what you do. So that was the second wave. The third wave really started in the late 90s, and early to late 90s. And the third wave of behavior therapy was, wait a minute, thoughts are important, but maybe we need to relate to our thoughts and our experience differently. So second wave CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, was all about, okay, we're going to change those thoughts, and then we're going to change how you feel, and then we're going to change what you do. But the key thing was, we're going to do something about your thoughts, and then we're going to change your behavior. And so the third wave came along and said, well, wait a minute, maybe we can't always change these thoughts. Maybe we need to have a different relationship to what they call internal events, thoughts, emotions, sensations. Instead of trying to fix all that and alter it and change it, maybe we can learn to relate to it with acceptance. And instead of trying to avoid these experiences, these thoughts, these feelings, these sensations, we can learn to accept them and still act on our values, still do the things that matter to us, and not let these thoughts, feelings, and sensations get in the way and have a whole life about avoidance and trying, I gotta stop this stuff. I can't feel this. I can't think this. Instead of having a life about trying to stop it and control it, our life could be about the things that matter to us, even though sometimes we have thoughts, feelings, and sensations that are kind of painful. And so it was a whole different way of relating. And so mindfulness, which is the core of third wave behavior therapy, the ability to observe our experience, our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, to watch them without trying to judge them, or in many cases even try to fix or change them, but just learning to watch and observe them, and then still live a valued, effective life. And so it was just a different way of relating to painful private experience than what we had in the second wave. And so what it did is allowed me as a therapist to work with people who were in pain, and that pain wasn't necessarily going to get better. That maybe they were still going to have some painful ruminative processes and thoughts. Maybe there was some anxiety that was inherited in their hardwired into their bodies and minds. Maybe there was some sadness and losses that they were struggling with that weren't going to change necessarily. But maybe even if these things weren't going to change, maybe their life could be valued and important in the face of that. And so that was this huge shift. Now we didn't have to necessarily get rid of the pain. Sometimes you can't get rid of it, but we could make their life better anyway.
You have a really unique vantage point as having been the publisher of New Harbinger, but also being a clinician and going through these different waves of therapy. So as we entered into the third wave, we're seeing acceptance and commitment therapy on the forefront. And as a clinician, you're bringing these into practice, but as the publisher for New Harbinger, what was it like to publish into this space and kind of be on the forefront of this new modality and put it into print?
Well, it starts really with Catherine Myers, because she was now the publisher, but at that time she was the head of acquisitions, and she was learning about ACT before I really knew about it at all. Acceptance commitment therapy. She was getting very interested. I knew some of the other third wave therapies like dialectical behavior therapy, Marshall Linehan's work, but Catherine really got interested in ACT and started turning me on to it. And we went down and took an ACT workshop together in LA from Steve Hayes, and it blew my mind. It was kind of revolutionary. It was like, oh my God, this is a whole different way of relating to human suffering. And it was fascinating. It was interesting, but it felt like it was going to give me tools as a therapist that would greatly extend what I could do to help people. And so it was at that point I could see its utility, because I could see what it would mean in terms of extending my ability to help. And Catherine was like, well, we got to start acquiring books about this. And this is evidence-based. It's a whole new way of thinking about pain and relating to pain. And so we just got very busy, learning, who are the major figures in acceptance commitment therapy, meeting with them, working with them to develop books. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time with Steve Hayes in Reno, working through and developing the ideas behind Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life, the first big ACT workbook that we did. And so that was just such an exciting thing, because it felt like we were on the forefront of something. It was the third wave, and we were right on the edge of it. and it really meant a lot to me, both as a clinician, and also as a publisher, that we could bring these books to the world, and not just bring them as concepts or ideas, or as books for professionals, but turn them into our classic self-help workbooks that could teach these skills to anyone who had $15 and wanted to learn them.
Yeah, I think, in my experience working at New Harbinger, obviously not a clinician, but there's something really special about ACT. I've attended a boot camp and it feels very emotional in a way that you wouldn't expect. And I kind of wonder your experience as a clinician sort of shifting into this values based therapy. Did you feel like you could connect more with your clients on a different level, or what was that experience like because it feels very emotional?
It felt like we could talk about making life different from just getting rid of pain, because CBT is more like, well, that hurts, we're going to help you with that, we'll get rid of that pain. And which is, I don't disparage that, but if you have these negative thoughts, we'll just learn to dispute them and help you think different, more positive thoughts. And so the focus is on kind of banishing pain. And but the experience with ACT was so different. It was and my clients, and I knew that a lot of my clients were not going to get rid of their pain. It was going to still be there. And so then the question is, how can you have a vital, engaged aliveness? And so that's what ACT offered. It was not just like, we're gonna turn the knob down on your pain and give you some tools to do that. It's about, how can you have a vital life that in which you're doing the things that really matter to you. And the classic example, if I can just say, is ACT's approach to chronic physical pain. And so ACT has developed a whole protocol for helping folks with chronic physical pain. And what they found was, well, you don't necessarily, the amount of pain you're in doesn't necessarily go down. But what happens is you start feeling a lot better about your life because you're living a life of values, of things that matter to you. That's what you're doing, instead of constantly focusing on your pain and trying to get rid of it, which you might not be able to do. So, I mean, to me, that's an example of, there's lots of things in life that we can't fix, but we can still have a better life anyway.
When I explain the different modalities to people in my life who aren't very familiar with psychology or any of the modalities in general, I always light up when I talk about ACT. It's just such a, it's so different than the others. And while they're definitely, very important and serve purposes for different sorts of issues and pain and suffering, ACT I really light up. I went to the boot camp with Cassie years ago, and we stared into each other's eyes for 7 minutes, and that was a very emotional experience. So
We've never been the same since.
yeah. So that was a really powerful boot camp with Robin Walzer a few years ago, and kind of talking about connecting with clients and how has it been, with therapy changing over the last, in the last third wave, but more specifically as we've transitioned into a space where we're doing a lot of teletherapy and we're really, connected to screens and things like that, and we're not able to have those in-person meetings with our clinicians. How have you seen that that's changed kind of the landscape of how therapy has been?
Well, that's really an important question. And, Robin Walser and I are co-directors of the Bay Area Trauma Recovery Clinic. And, uh, you know, just like every other clinic, we had to basically shut down and just offer remote services starting in March 2 years ago. And we're still remote. And there's good things and not good things that have come out of that. I think that the good thing is that we can see clients that are far away. and they're, we can now serve people who can't commute into our clinic. And also it's just easier for them to get services. Even taking commuting aside, it's like all you have to do is click on a Zoom link and you're in, and therapy can start. And so there's something that it's made therapy easier. And the other thing is that psychotherapy does depend on a relationship in large measure, and a therapeutic alliance building between the client and the therapist, and that's really important. I think telehealth and remote therapy have maybe reduced the level of connection between therapist and client somewhat, but we're finding in our clinic that beautiful, good work can still be done. Clients can still fully engage in psychotherapy. They can use things like EMDR. We can do that remotely. We can do prolonged exposure remotely. We can do a lot of ACT work for trauma remotely, and so we're seeing really good outcomes with remote work. And there have been some studies, by the way, that looking at does remote work impede or limit the effectiveness of psychotherapy, and at this point it looks like it doesn't very much, if at all. And we see that in our clinic. And so I see a lot of upside from Zoom or remote psychotherapy, and not a whole lot of downside. So I think the future is going to bear that out. I think we're going to see that therapy is going to be more hybrid, that therapists will see some of their clients in person and some of their clients will be remote. And part of that will depend on how far away the client is and what the client's preferences are, and how maybe how much the client needs a personal in-person relationship. But I think we're going to see a lot of hybrid work, and it's going to make psychotherapy more available to a wider group of people, I think.
Yeah, I think the accessibility, it opens it wide up for more people who maybe can't get into the office or take the time off work, or, those things. And I wonder if you had any thoughts. I have to imagine that the past 2 years of working in therapy, like, probably leads to a lot of burnout. And I wonder, like, if you had any thoughts about that for therapists who have been, kind of just hanging on and then carrying their clients.
And maybe seeing an increase in how many clients because of telework or
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Certainly, there are a lot more people needing psychotherapy and seeking psychotherapy than there were. Most therapists now are full. Their practices are full, and there's just not enough therapists to go around. Also, therapists are charging pretty high rates. I mean, the average rates in the Bay Area are like between $250 and $300 an hour. I mean, that's an awful lot for an hour of conversation. So the rates are high. The therapist practices are full. So that, and there's still a tremendous need and demand. And I think that's where self-help comes in. That's where apps come in, and more limited or remote forms of therapy that might not be an hour. They might be 15 minutes. They might be 20 minutes. So that I think we're going to develop new forms that extend therapy to be helpful to more people and more cheaply, more economically. So I think all that is coming, and I think the pandemic has accelerated those changes, and I'm looking forward to that. And I also do think that it increases the place, as I said, for self-help. There's a role for self-help here. When people can't get to a therapist and the therapist is too expensive, evidence-based self-help can really fill the bill. And we've seen quite a few research projects over the years in which researchers have used our book and our books and just with people reading it and then measuring the improvement in certain um, uh, you know, anxiety, depression, and so forth. Um, and we see that people benefit just about as much from a self-help book as they do from psychotherapy for lots of conditions. And that's important because it means that now, um, the mental health system is strained. There's not enough practitioners to go around, but people can actually still get help from a book or an app or some form of self-help. I think that's beautiful and important change.
I think that mental health in general is having a moment that it's really never had before in terms of the conversation surrounding it. You're seeing people being very vulnerable on, social media or different formats. With their experience, you're seeing therapists come out with very large followings on Instagram to talk about mental health disorders and to offer some of that help. So I think that with the self-help books, that goes right. People are seeking out that help. Finding a clinician is really difficult. And like you said, it can be expensive. And so having those resources is so crucial. And I like to think, or that it's always been in my mind, that New Harbinger's whole mission was really providing affordable and accessible tools to people who are in need. And I just wanted to talk about that and why that was so important in the beginning and why it's more important than ever now to have those tools available to help alleviate that suffering for people.
Well, I guess part of it, this goes back to I guess my work as a psychotherapist, but I've always worked in low fee clinics for years. I started one in the Haight-Ashbury Psych Services, 40 something years ago, and started one in Berkeley, the Berkeley CBT clinic, and then this more recent clinic, the clinic, the trauma clinic. And my feeling, and I did that because people couldn't afford therapy, and they, and this it's worse now than ever. There's this huge gap between who needs it and who can afford it, and the problem's only gotten worse. So, one answer was to create these low fee clinics that usually use therapy. The therapists are usually graduate students who are being trained, and in exchange for their training, they do a lot of good therapy work. And that model is, there a lot of people are getting help with that model, but it's not enough. And low fee therapy clinics there's just not enough of them to really fill the gap. And therefore, we need self-help materials that are affordable, but several things. They have to be affordable. They have to be evidence-based, so that they're actually based on research, and they have to be presented in ways that people can get and use easily. They can't be abstruse. They can't be difficult to read or understand. And the exercises and the change processes in these materials have to be something that are presented in ways that people can embrace and use them. And I see that as really, really crucial and important. And I see we're moving in that direction, certainly the books, but there's apps, there's all kinds of things that are now developing. And, even in social media and the blogosphere, there are a lot of people that are teaching about mental health and how to deal with certain kinds of emotions and problems. And so, this is not just the domain of therapists and the psychological sciences. This is now spreading, and there are a lot of people who are good teachers who are spreading the word about how to get better, how to help yourself using the tools that are evidence-based. So I see this as just burgeoning now, and it's very exciting. I love being at this moment in time to be able to witness this, because when I started out, none of this was available, and people had to, people were just signing up for classic psychodynamic therapy, or that would go on for years, and in as many cases have minimal improvement, and minimal change. They just have somebody to listen to them every week, but their lives are not getting better. And so, we've moved out more and more out of that era to a place where we have effective therapies, but also therapies that are available not just sitting across from somebody, but things that we can do ourselves. So I see this as just an amazing improvement over where we were 40 years ago.
Definitely. And, like you said, it's really important to meet people where they are. And I think that's one thing that, the self-help books that New Harbinger publishes does really well. Like if you're depressed, you might not read a book that's 1,000 pages to figure out your depression, but you might have time to do a page in a workbook every night and work through it. And I think that's, the power of the self-help book, really. And I wonder, talking about how there is a shortage of clinicians, hopefully there are more training out there to get into psychotherapy. What advice would you give for clinicians on, how to keep their practice uh, up to date with like the changing landscape of therapy as things keep progressing and we keep learning more?
Well, first of all, you have to specialize. You can't, and I say this to my students, if you're going into this field, you can't possibly know all of the therapy interventions for a wide variety of problems that people are going to show up with. It's just like doctors specialize. You're an enterologist. You're dealing with the digestive system. You're not a neurologist. So people, and the reason is because there's just too much knowledge to effectively work with neurology and the gut at the same time. And this is the same is true in psychotherapy. So it's really important for therapists to start specializing so that they actually have a chance to hold on to and continue to digest and learn the important knowledge in their field. And as their field develops, they're keeping up with it. They're noticing what the newest interventions are. And you just can't do that if you're a generalist. So, learning to specialize is number one, and then continuing to read the science, to read the literature. What's coming out now that makes a difference? And there are websites and so forth that digest some of the new evidence-based therapies and help therapists keep up with what's going on in their particular bailiwick. So I just want to, I would be encouraging therapists to recognize that they can't know it all. And in fact, if you try to treat everybody who comes in the door, regardless of their problem, you're going to end up doing some pretty bad therapy, because there are going to be lots of people come in with, and you don't really understand what's going on with them, and you don't have the knowledge of the evidence-based therapies that have been developed to help them. So that's really a problem. And I think the era of the generalist is over. And we need to admit that there's too much knowledge out there for us to hold it all. We have to get specialized.
And I have a follow-up to that, Matt. When we're talking about now transitioning to someone who's in search of therapy, and this might be the $1,000,000 question, but how does someone who's looking for a therapist and they might not know what their diagnosis is, but they're having some trouble, how do they know what kind of therapist to seek out? I've had a lot of people in my life ask me what kind of modalities they should be focusing on, which I always say you're going to have to kind of make that decision for yourself, or your therapist is going to have to take that approach with you. But the question remains is, what should you be looking for in a therapist, especially with or not going the generalized route, but going like a more specialist type route?
Well, there are apps and systems for actually diagnosing yourself. And so that's one way to start is to actually try to identify, well, what is my problem here? What's going on with me? And again, there are apps that can help people kind of figure some of that out. But ultimately, it's about being able to first of all only work with somebody who does evidence-based psychotherapy. That's number one. That does CBT or ACT or DBT or MBC. They are doing something that there's lots of science to support the interventions that they're using and the effectiveness of what they're doing. So That's number one. So you ask questions like, what's your orientation? And the person says, I do psychoanalytic work. You run for the hills. Because it's unlikely that you're going to get a whole lot of help there. But then you describe your symptoms. If you actually know, I have a panic problem, or I have a lot of worry and generalized anxiety, or if you know what's going on, being able to describe it, and then asking the therapist, what level of expertise they have with that problem, with that set of symptoms. What do they know about that? What orientation do they have in terms of evidence-based work? And what evidence-based approach would they take with the problems that you're describing? And so, I think it's important for a potential client to interview their therapist before signing up, and make sure that the therapist actually can give them some idea of an evidence-based treatment plan for the problems and the symptoms that the potential client is describing. So I think it's important to choose wisely. And the way you choose is you make sure you have a therapist who is oriented towards science and evidence-based work, and then actually has some knowledge and expertise in the particular set of problems that you're presenting with.
I think that's so important. And, one thing I've told friends who have come to me also asking about how to find a therapist, we sort of get that working at New Harbinger. I always tell them, sometimes the first one isn't the best fit. Like, I think that's a common thing that people feel like they have one bad experience and that, therapy isn't for them. Like, sometimes it takes um, a few of these meetings to find the right one. And I like what you said about interviewing them, because maybe that could save some people the trouble of the search, right? Like they can interview them and know if it's a good fit at the outset before they invest their time and money. But I think that's a really nice place to start to wrap up our conversation. Matt, do you have any final thoughts you want to share with the listeners?
Well, I guess what I want to say is that, when people are struggling, when they're in pain, there are answers out there. There's help that's available, and whether you seek help in the form of a therapist who does evidence-based work with the kind of problem that you're struggling with, or you seek help from from published materials, books, apps, and so forth, uh, you can get better. Uh, Not only can in many cases you live with less pain, but you can live a more vital and values-based life. And so the help is there. And I just want to encourage people who are struggling and suffering to reach out and get that help in one form or the other.
Well, I think that was a great parting piece, Matt. And I think that, or I have always thought that New Harbinger has done such a wonderful job at really communicating the mission of bringing those resources to people, giving them immediate relief and strategies to help them in the moment to alleviate that suffering. And that's really huge.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks so much for all of this and all of your work. I was going to ask how you do it all. You're mentioning all your clinics, you have New Harbinger, you're a therapist, you're a professor. It's just really inspiring. And, we're really thankful, to have done this work with you and New Harbinger.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Kendall and Cassie. I really enjoyed our conversation.
The Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook broke new ground when it was first published in 1980, detailing easy, step-by-step techniques for calming the body and mind in an increasingly overstimulated world. Now in its 7th edition, this fully revised and updated workbook, highly regarded by therapists and their clients, offers the latest stress reduction techniques to combat the effects of stress and integrate healthy relaxation habits into every aspect of daily life. In this workbook, you'll explore your own stress triggers and symptoms and learn how to create a personal action plan for stress reduction. Each chapter features a different method for relaxation, explains why the method works, and provides on-the-spot exercises you can do when you feel stressed out. The result is a comprehensive yet accessible workbook that will help you curb stress and cultivate a more peaceful life. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.
Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information. Well, that's a wrap on season 1 of Evidence Based.
Thank you so much for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed all these really important conversations.
And we're pleased to share that we'll be back for season 2.
See you in the fall.